Alright, now we're into it. So now if you write a message, I'll see it. Alright, and I'm going to open up the notes for this week as well. Alright, and we're ready to go finally. Okay, and Nay, you said you need those notes. And you can't access Blackboard. That's annoying. How can I give those to you? Did you say you are on... Oh, you did get it? That's good. Alright, awesome. That's frustrating. I wonder what's going on with your Blackboard. Nice. Thanks, Andrew. Alright, so last week, what I went over with was, the first part was adding Google Recaptcha, which was part of your Lab 3, or 4, I should say. So Google Recaptcha, just for those of you that are kind of new to it, the whole concept is to basically prevent bots from being able to submit your form and look for vulnerabilities. Because that's generally what hackers do. They're not going to go to every form on the internet. Instead, they're going to build a crawler that's going to crawl across the internet, look for forms, try them out with a few different hacks, and see if any of them take. And if they do, then report back and say, hey, this is a vulnerable site. Then a hacker will actually perform a strategy to be able to hack that particular site. Google Recaptcha basically prevents the bot from being able to do that because it recognizes that it's a bot. As soon as it makes that recognition, it basically forces the bot to try to solve a puzzle that likely only a human can solve, and then the bot fails and moves on. Most times the way hackers usually build these kind of things is the second they hit the Google Recaptcha, they bypass it. It's not worth their time. They're really looking for sites that are super easy to hack. They don't want to have to deal with a site that, is more complicated. And plus the information that a lot of the time that they're looking for is like password information, because a lot of people use the same username and password on every site they ever join. So if they can find a vulnerable site and grab those pieces of details, or even better, credit card numbers or anything like that, those are much more accessible and easier to access for them when they don't have things like Google Recaptcha or even something like a honeypot, like I mentioned last week. So Google Recaptcha is one part of, securing your site. Another big part of securing your site is by creating a gateway, basically, a gated access. So gated access's purpose is to restrict content to only users or members, right, that have joined your site. And you might do that for different reasons. Like, for example, at LMG, we have gated content where you sign up as a member for one of our article brands. You pay a fee per month, and then you get to access all this gated content. Some of the gated content is even ad-free, right? So you join the site, you pay a small fee, but then you get to get rid of the ads. Right, that kind of thing. A lot of newspapers, a lot of articles are kind of doing that. Kind of sucks that you have to deal with all that, but it's just the way it is. And then other gated content, like things like Netflix or Amazon or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, right? All of that is gated content. Often you'll have like a public version of it, like a public side, right, where you can actually sign up or view maybe even preview material or, free articles or free videos or whatever. But then you'll have this gated portion where you sign up and then pay a fee, and then you get this extra stuff, or you don't pay a fee and you just get extra things for being a member, right? Like Facebook, for example, you can go to Facebook, you can view posts and public profiles all you want without being a member, but if you want to comment, create some sort of interaction against a post or add a friend, you have to sign up, right? So that's gated content. So last week what we did was we actually created the registration form for being able to sign up a user. So hopefully you have that. If not, you will need to run the user's SQL, which you can do in your database, whether you're using phpMyAdmin or MySQL Workbench. Whatever one you use in Jess's class is the one you need to use. And I put mine underneath the database table, right? So I just went to user SQL, copied it, pasted it in my window here, double clicked on database, so that's the one I was using. Hit my button, which is going to fail because I already have the table. That creates the users table for me, and off we go. The one explanation that I should mention here is that we have this unique field. Have you used this before? Have you guys created unique fields in your database class, your relational database class? Okay, so you guys know what they are then. So for those of you that might not be as familiar with them, they essentially force a unique value in that particular field. So the emails have to be unique. You cannot have an email that is a duplicate of another email. It won't allow it. Just completely forces it so that you can't do it. So unique key is super important. They're also indexable. So you can actually create an index on your unique key as well, which is pretty cool, which makes things like searching across emails a lot easier when you're trying to be able to find users by their email address. We're not going to have enough users to really make that a thing, but like it is something that you should be aware of. That indexing does help you be able to search a database a lot quicker. So I'm going to navigate to localhost. I'm going to navigate to our live files here. Comp 1006 Wednesday-03, and I'm going to go to the lesson 10 folder that I copied over, and that brings up the registry. Make sure you look at this connect script. If you guys didn't go through the lesson last week, make sure you look at the connect script and adjust the values so they correspond to your connect scripts. One thing I have been noticing is that this return statement does not work the way I want it to in the connect. What I would rather do, if you guys are cool with this, I think it just makes more sense to me. I'm going to actually change that return to a var dump. And then add an exit. So basically, if we wind up with any database issues, we're just going to literally var dump out what the error is and exit the script. That will help us a little bit figuring out what our problems are. Because I've noticed that some of the issues, most of the issues that I've seen so far, tend to be database connection issues. So after last week, we were actually able to register a new user, right? We got that far. However, we weren't able to do anything like log in or create gated content or any of that type of stuff, right? So let's take a quick look at what the registration looks like. So we have a page here called register.php. In the register.php, we added some helpful user experience things in place. We start our session, which allows us to use session variables. I know you guys are familiar with session variables based on that test that you guys took a while ago. So session variables, they persist for the length of the session. The session lasts for the length of your browser being open. The second you close your browser, you lose your session, unless you explicitly delete your session. But keep that in mind that you can even leave this site and come back, and those session variables will still exist. They are not site-specific, they are browser-based specific. You can modify session variables and tie them directly more to the site. I'm not entirely 100% sure how you do it, but you can do things like that. You can modify session variables so they only exist for the length of the time of the site being alive. But yeah, that's the cool thing about session variables. They're so important when it comes to programming because the intranet is stateless. When you submit a form, you get your form values from the page you submitted to the page that it's going to. Once you leave that page where you get to process those form values, it's done. That post disappears, or that get disappears. It only lasts for that one transaction from A to B. That's it. Whereas session variables will last for the entire lifespan of your application, right? Until the browser closes. So in this little bit of a blurb, we're basically taking session form values that we store inside our our insert.php, and we assign these to form values. Because we're going to use this pattern in other places like our login or any other resources we were to create, we want to make sure that we get rid of this, right? We don't want to keep this around, because what will happen is In the login form, for example, if we had this around, it will pre-populate this with values that you may not want it to pre-populate with. So it's a good point to make sure you clear these values out, so that way they're gone and then you start with a fresh form. However, when the user submits and we hit some errors and we send them back to the form, that's where the importance of this comes into play. Because then they're able to pre-populate the form, they can start from the pre-populated form, fix whatever their errors are, and move on. Some of the forms that you guys have been integrating into your phase projects are like monolithic, right? I've encountered some that have like 15 different fields in them. That's fine. It's not a great user experience, and there are better ways to do that. But you definitely want to pre-populate that form if the user makes an error. You don't want them to have to fill out that whole form again. That's a horrible user experience. So anyways, once we've got the values stored in the form values, we unset them. That way, if they hit the refresh button, yeah, the form will clear. If they move to a different page and come back, the form will remain cleared, that kind of thing. So it only lasts for that one transaction. That's it. And just so you know, these form values get loaded in these fields down here, where we're doing this kind of shorthand text. This less than question mark equals shorthand text for an echo statement in PHP. We're outputting this value if it exists, if it's not falsy, as long as it's not, undefined or null or false, basically falsy, right? As long as it's not a falsy value and it exists, we'll output the value. Otherwise, that's what these things mean, basically, or, right? We'll just output null. Right? And we do the same thing across all of the fields, except for the password field, because it doesn't make sense to you. You want them to re-enter that password each time. You don't want to pre-populate it, because it's just not a good idea to pre-populate it. I don't think you can, actually. I think even if you put the value there, it doesn't actually register and you don't see anything. So, right, so they submit this form, so we can fill it out here. So asdf@asdf.com. I think I created this user earlier. At asdf.com. Oh, that's the email address. We'll put that down here. And we'll just make this asdf, 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 asdf. And we'll register. And sure enough, I've been registered successfully. So let's see what happens that causes that. So this form goes to insert.php. Inside our insert.php, we created a function to do error handling, which makes our lives a little simpler, because any errors we encounter, we just pass them on to the function, and then the function will actually allow us to be able to redirect back to the register.php page and bulk at whatever issues we have, right? We create a variable to basically store those errors. This first chunk is us dealing with our Recaptcha, right? So we get the Recaptcha from the form. We use that wonderful little API call that we kind of learned the week before in order to call the Google Recaptcha API, pass in our secret, pass in our post Recaptcha, get our information back from them, right? Then we store it as response data, which we have to decode, which you'll remember also from the API lesson. And then we're able to check it. So when you decode, it turns these into objects instead of associative arrays. So you have to access the data from it like a field, like you're accessing a field, right? So we use these scrawny, thin arrows, skinny arrows, and we access whatever field it is that we want to access. And if it failed, right, so if there was no success, we basically just say, hey, the Recaptcha failed, and we tell them what the error was. And that's basically it. Then we deconstruct all of our values out of the post object, right? The post object generally looks like this. Just post that in the chat. But we're using this cool method that Jess kind of opened my eyes to that I didn't know about before. It allows you to be able to search the post object for values. If the value doesn't exist, it basically sets this to be null, right? Which is kind of cool. So if first name doesn't exist, then this variable, instead of just being empty, is actually set to null. Same with last name, email confirmation, password, and password confirmation. Having that information is awesome, because then we can create things like this cool array. We can iterate over that array, and we can look for things like the field, right? And if the field doesn't exist, then we can go ahead and deal with those issues. So we can turn it into a human field readable. We can add an error message. I also introduced this topic of variable variables. A variable variable kind of works like this. So I have a variable called first name, right? But I don't want to store all the variables in here and iterate because I want to get the label from it. I can't get the label from the variable itself. I need to have a string to do that. So if I want to access the variable called first name, but all I have is this string, I can essentially create something that looks like this. Right? But I can't type that into PHP, it will actually blow up. So instead, if I store that variable, right? So in field, if I take that string and store it into field, I can access the first name variable by calling field, which is almost the equivalence to doing that. It's basically the same idea. So it's a way to dynamically access variables. Variable variables are cool. They don't exist in all languages, though. Actually, they're quite rare. In JavaScript, they kind of are there. You can access them as long as you define variables with var. But at the end of the day, all you're doing actually is creating properties on the global object or on the window object in that scenario. So when you go to access your variable or dynamic variable, really you're just accessing a dynamic property. And if that's the case and you need dynamic variables, then you would create an object and do it that way anyways. There is a little chunk here that we didn't talk about last week. It looks like it managed to make it through from today's lesson, which is basically just taking a look to see if the password field is here. If it is, it just continues on. Otherwise, we're sanitizing. And the reason why I'm doing this is I had a student this week notice that if they entered in a like an HTML comment, it managed to pass through the form fields and into the database, and then when they were reloading it, it would actually cause their page to blow up because it would render the HTML. So if they can render HTML, you can sure as hell render script tags, which means we're not sanitizing script tags, which means we're susceptible to cross-site scripting. So we need to 100% do this filter sanitize, because that will actually strip any script tags out, convert HTML tags over to their like character encoded values, and basically just make all HTML and script tags basically junk. Yeah, I can. I'll just give you the whole for each loop there, Andrew. So insert.php. So after that, everything else is the same as last week. Validating the email address to make sure it's in the correct format. Because we're doing this filter validate here on line 37, if it wasn't in the correct format, email would be an empty string. Actually, it would be a null value, making it falsy, which allows us to be able to do this kind of shorthand comparison check. Check to make sure the email and the email confirmation match, and the whole purpose of that is because you want to make sure that your email and email confirmation are the same. That ensures that the user intentionally meant it to be in the format that they typed it in. However, just to let you know, often what somebody will do on a register form, they'll type in the email address, copy it, and paste it into the email confirmation, which means there's no guarantee there. Password and password confirmation, obviously you can't do that, but the same process is in place. Once they type the password, by typing it in a second time, you're kind of guaranteeing that they know that password. Ideally, if you have a registration form, you also have a password reset, right? So it allows them to be able to reset their password at some point, for obvious reasons, because they're going to need to be able to change that password in the future. And you don't want to have to deal with the tech support side of that, where people are calling in to change their passwords and you're manually changing them in the database. That's pretty terrible. We check to see if there's any errors after all of that validation. If there are any, we'll be taking those errors, putting them into the session errors, redirecting back to the register.php page, and telling the user, hey, you've got a bunch of errors. So if I click register, you cannot leave the first name blank, you cannot leave the last name blank, blah, 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 right? Just gives them a whole slew of errors. Huh, my config is dead. Right, I think I already knew that. I'm missing my config file that I had before. So we have a lowercase, the email. This is the only normalization that we're doing. We're lowercasing our email. And then we're hashing our password. So this is the first part of the authentication piece that we were talking about last week. Hashing the password is a twofold process. You provide it the raw password that the user puts into their password confirmation field, or into their password field here. You take that and you apply it as the first argument inside the password hash, right? So it's the first value, that's the raw value for it. It takes that and then you tell it what algorithm you want to execute. And there are a whole bunch of different algorithms. As Andrew pointed out, actually, some of the algorithms were not actually mentioned in the slide deck, and I apologize for that. But the algorithms that are available are bcrypt, all of the SHA versions, and also Aragon. Aragon is probably the most powerful algorithm that are out there, and it's used quite often, especially in robust systems where you really want deep encryption. The default password is bcrypt, is the default one that is used, which is an algorithm that just basically uses, I think it uses SHA-256 in order to encrypt it. But that's not the only thing happening in the wonderful magic of password hash. There is also a salt key that gets auto-generated by PHP. When you create your password, the salt key is added to the password, and then the whole thing is encrypted. So to decrypt it, it needs to know that salt key, and only PHP knows the algorithm in order to decode the salt key. So if somebody was to dump our database, for example, and just grab all of our users from our database, like, so I have ASDF at ASDF.com, this password here that I'll share with you, I don't want to copy the row, just the field. So this password here is the password for ASDF. But if I create another user, and also give them the same password as ASDF and register them, run my little select statement here, copy that field. If you compare those two values, you will notice that they are different. And the reason they're different is because of that salt key. The salt key actually forces the values to be different. However, password verify, which is the counterpart to password hash, basically knows how to decrypt the salt key, add it into the password and all that kind of thing, and figure out whether or not the password matches or not. Password hashing is a one-way cryptography strategy. It only goes in one direction, right? So you can hash it, but you can't dehash it. So the idea is that once it's hashed, there's no chance of somebody basically taking it and decrypting it and getting out your password from it. Instead, what a hacker will do, because there's no point in doing that, instead what a hacker would do, they're going to take a dictionary of passwords and they're going to hammer them against that value to see which ones match. So they will use the password verify built into PHP and basically hammer against that password to see if it matches. If they get a match, then they'll log that as being a vulnerable password in a dictionary somewhere that other hackers access as well. So that's basically how that works. There's ways around that, obviously, with authentication, that you can do things like brute force detection, where you basically log the user's IP address and you maintain their IP during the whole transaction. But it's not just the IP address. You actually record a few different values from their request in order to keep track of whether it's the same person hammering your server. Usually it's the same password, and then they'll try the same, or they'll try a different email over and over again. Or they'll try the same email and then try a different password over and over again. So you can use that combination of values to go, nope, you're done, and block them so that they can't try that value set again, and lock it up. WordPress has that built into it, actually. Then we go ahead and get our connect, insert our user, go through our preparation statements, obviously, because we can't trust data from the user because they're either a hacker or an idiot. We talked about this before. And then we go ahead and execute, and if they're good, then we register them and redirect back to the login page, which takes them here, right, to this page. And then otherwise we error handle their errors, right? So that's basically where we ended last week. Now this week, we're on to those new things. So login.php is where we're going to start. Any questions about any of the stuff from last week before we move on to login.php and log in our user? No? All right. You guys are quiet today. Usually you're more chatty. Okay, so I'm positive that every single one of you has had a login experience, right? Because you're all in Blackboard. So you couldn't be in Blackboard if you didn't have a login experience of some sort. So I'm not sure if you've ever actually thought about the strategy of how logging in kind of unfolds. Basically, your user, right, is going to fill out this email field and their password field, and then they hit login. And then that's the black box. That's the thing that people don't know what happens after that point. Well, if we look under the hood, basically what occurs is those details are then sent from the form either through the post body or the param body, depending on whether or not you're doing a GET request or a POST request. Let's just assume we're doing it properly and we're doing it as a POST request. So it gets added to the post body. Post body hits the Apache server. The Apache server passes the post body in a format that PHP will understand to PHP, and PHP will turn that into the post associative array. When we call that input post underneath that filter input, it's actually accessing that post associative array. I bet you dollars to donuts, input post is a constant that literally points at that exact same value. It's just an alias for that value. So the user details are put in a post body and sent to the authentication script. The authentication script then takes that username or email address and it looks it up in the database. Long time ago, when PHP was kind of like first and fresh, we used to encode passwords, put them in the database with something called MD5. Did anybody use PHP that long ago where you were coding passwords as using MD5? I don't know how many of you actually have past PHP experience. No? So yeah, we use this thing called MD5. It doesn't even exist anymore. It's gone. It's deprecated. But the problem with MD5 is that MD5 was two-way, right? So you can encrypt it or decrypt it. So generally what you did was you took their password, you encrypted it with MD5, then you compared it to the password in the database and saw whether or not the two were the same, right? And if the two were the same, then you would turn around and say, okay, they're obviously logged in. So you would take that email address and that password and write a SQL query that looks for the same combination in the database. We don't do that anymore, though. Instead, now what we do is we get the email address, we look up the user, and we pull them back. Once we have the user, we take the password verify function, which does the proper algorithm detection on the password, and it applies it to the salt key, and then does a comparison to the hashed password that you pulled back from the user account. Once that is validated, if it's valid, then it moves you on to the next stage. You add that user as into the session, basically some way to store them so that you can keep track of the fact that they're logged in. Session obviously makes the most amount of sense there. Otherwise, you send them back to login and you give them a very vague message, because it's the whole concept of security using obscurity. The idea is that you don't want to say, hey, you know what, your email was correct, but your password was wrong. Or, hey, your email was wrong, but your password was correct. That's too much information to give to the hacker, because the hacker will use that information, log it, and then attempt the thing that is incorrect over and over again with different versions. So you don't want that to happen. Obviously, that's a bad idea. So the best thing to do is just send a thing back saying the password email address combination that you submitted was incorrect, or your email password was incorrect. Very little information, all the information they need in order to know that they need to put in the proper information, and that's it, right? You're not giving them any extra details. So in order to go through this whole process, we do want to add some kind of nice user experiences in the login form for the user. Just like we did in the registration form, where we have this start value and unset with the form values. We want to do the same thing inside here so that we can take those values and pass them into our fields and pre-populate the field in case they submit and they get an error back, right? So super easy. We just start the session first. We store our form values just like we did last week. We're going to assume the key is called form values. And if it isn't present, if it's undefined, or if it's falsy, we want to create a fallback of null. All right, so we start the session, store our form values, and then we immediately clear them so that if they move from this page to another page, those values aren't following them around for the life cycle of their time in our application. So we run an unset $_session form values. And then that unsets those form values for us. So that's fine, that's cool. We've got our ability to deal with the form values. We've created a slightly better user experience than we had before. Now we want to take these form values and actually apply them to the fields that matter. We're not going to apply them to the password field because it doesn't make sense, right? We leave that blank. But we do scroll down to our email field that we have here. I'm just going to shrink my form up a bit. There we go. This email field, and right beside the required, we're going to add a new attribute called value. And then inside here, we're going to spit out a little bit of PHP. And this is where that shorthand echo statement really comes in handy. I love the shorthand echo statement instead of having to write PHP echo. Just makes more sense to write that little shorthand statement. We access those form values, and we're looking for the email address. And there is a potential chance of it not existing. If I just leave that and hit refresh, I'm okay because form values is null. Actually, I'm kind of surprised it didn't actually return an error. I mean, it's fine. I guess we're fine. That's weird. It should actually return back an error. If we want to protect against an error, though, we can just add the $! null, and then there's not a chance of it wind up, having an error inside of it. I'll give you that input field. How many of you actually know what Mockingbird Lane is? I mean, the hint is all through the whatchamacallits, the placeholders. No idea? It's where the Munsters lived. The Munsters lived on Mockingbird Lane. And Herman Munster was like the dad. You guys haven't watched the Munsters? Munsters are a great show. Super old though. 60s, I want to say. I'm not that old, but I mean, obviously I saw reruns growing up. Alright, so we have our email, we have everything in place. I mean, none of it's going to work yet. Even if I click login, I mean, it's going to go to the login page, but or to the Authenticate page, but there's nothing there, right? So if I type in ASDF at asdf.com, ASDF, and hit login, it's just going to go to a blank page. And it's going to this Authenticate page, right? Because that's our action, and it's using the post method, which means all of those form values are being added to the post object and being sent with it. So that's our next place to begin, is in the authenticate.php page. So authenticating a user, like I said before, step 1, attempt to select the user from the database using their email address only. And step 2, if the user exists, verify that their hash password matches the hash password in the database. Right? That's basically our concept here. So we're going to want to connect to the database, which means we need to require our connection script, right? Which is _connect.php, I believe. Make sure if you haven't already that you have fixed your connection details, right? Because right now they're my connection details, so fix them so you're your connection details. Which I'm sure you guys already know that. If you want to reassign the connection value, you can. I know some people would prefer to do that than call DBO everywhere and do the chaining off DBO. So we're going to need to create our SQL, and like I said before, we never trust the user. We never trust the user because the user can be what? One of two things. What are the two things that a user can be? Or that we're always going to assume they are? Yep, hacker or stupid. That's right. By assuming that, as much as it sounds pessimistic, we protect our application, which is the thing. That's the thing that matters the most. It matters more than the user. Protecting the application's data. You owe it to your client. So here we're writing a SQL statement, and we're using the bound parameter because, again, we're not going to trust the user that they're actually typing a proper email in there, right? We're going to need that email address. So let's go ahead and actually destructure our values. I didn't write that in here. Let's destructure our values. I'm using the word destructure, though I don't think that's actually correct. Destructuring is something that's built into JavaScript, which is so cool. I love destructuring. It's so awesome. Filter, input post, right? The thing that we're looking for, the email address. And then if you want, you can do a validation here, right? Validate email, and that will actually wind up causing the email to be a whatchamacallit value, just a falsy value if it isn't the correct format. We can lowercase it as well because we are lowercasing it in our application. And pass in that email address. And it probably wouldn't hurt to grab the password that they passed to us as well, using the filter input. But we don't apply any validation to it. We don't apply any validation, and we don't apply any sanitization to it. Why is that? Why do we not apply other mutable things to it? It's super important we keep that password in the format that it's in. Yeah, exactly. We want to keep it raw. We don't want to modify the user's password in any way, or they won't be able to log in. And then that leads to the next thing, which is lots of phone calls to your support line asking you why they can't log in. And by the way, all users assume you know exactly the things they've done. They all assume that. It doesn't matter if you have 9 million users. They all assume you know who they are and that you know exactly the thing they did. Probably that's why, because we have, that's probably the reason we have audit trails now. Just so when the user's like, you know that thing I did last week? Tell me your name. It's Marigold. Okay, Marigold. Wait 2 seconds. I'll check my audit trail. Yep, there's Marigold. There's her audit trail from last week. Here's the 10 dumb things she did. Which dumb thing is it, Marigold, that you did? That's what audit trails are for. They're super handy. Let's prep our SQL. So we've got our SQL nicely prepared. And then obviously we're going to bind our value, right? So statement, bind param, the email address, the email we grabbed, and then we're going to use PDO param string. And this is the thing that's actually protecting us at the end of the day anyways. So even if they pass the wrong password, like say they passed a password loaded with JavaScript stuff, right? Just loaded it chock full of JavaScript so that they were going to try to cross-site script us, or we're going to try a SQL injection because that's more likely what they would do with their password. This wonderful statement right here, bound parameters, prevents that, because what happens is it doesn't matter what password you've passed. If you pass the PDO param string, it casts it to a string literal, and no matter what, you can't break out of the literal because it literally escapes everything inside of it. So what a hacker will try to do is they'll pass their password like this, right? They'll be like, my pass, and then they'll end it with a semicolon. And then they'll try select star from whatever, like, or just even show tables, or use database, or show database, right? Or describe database. They'll do something like that in order to get what information they have. And if you're not properly protecting casting your string, then it runs that SQL query, and they can do things like drop your database or describe the database and grab all the tables from it. Cheeky, cheeky. It was a very common thing through the 90s and the early millennium, hacking databases. People did it literally all the time. So once we've done that, we can go ahead and grab our user. Sorry, we need to execute first. Execute. That obviously executes the prepared statement. And then we're ready to grab our user. So user equals $STMT fetch. Now when you do fetch, I showed this to the other class because they didn't realize, because I keep typing in PDO fetch ASOC, and they were asking me what's that for because they've never used it before. So when you do a fetch, if I do a refresh here, base table review not available, database table user. Did I type user? I typed user instead of users. Make sure in your SQL statement you're writing users. Right, so when I do my fetch, let me zoom in a little bit. You can see here that I have this ID 5, but then I have another column with 0 and the 5. And the reason that is because it actually fetches it and returns it as an ASOC array, so like an associative array, as well as a numerical array. So you get both pieces. So you wind up with 10 rows of data in here because of that. If you wanted to do something dynamic with this, like grab these fields and display them, you would have to first strip out all of the numerical array pieces. But actually there's a very easy way to do that. If you type in PDO fetch ASOC, run this same query again, you only get the associative array. So you don't have to worry about the numerical array because you only get the associative array. Even cooler than that, if you're a person who likes object-oriented programming and you're building out classes and you want to make sure that everything stays object-oriented, you can actually make your object, your database rows come back as an object. So you can hit refresh, and there you go. And then to access those pieces, all you would do is use that skinny arrow and then choose the field you want to access. See? ASDF. So a couple of things, like really powerful little thing to put in there. So I like using ASOC. Plus you save half that data structure's worth of memory, which isn't a lot, but still. I mean, it becomes a lot if you're doing a lot of iterations and grabbing huge amounts of rows, then you definitely want to try to shave off as much as you possibly can. So the next thing we're going to do is check to see if the user exists, and if they do, then we're good. But if they don't, we want to set our authentication or our authorization to false. So let's create a flag variable called auth and set it to false right now. And we'll basically treat that as like, if auth is false, you're not logged in. We'll create an if statement here. If $, sorry, if exclamation mark $user, so they're not currently logged in, we don't actually have a user account, then we set auth equal to false, right? But we could just wrap this up in a better expression that makes more sense, that it's a little bit less amount of logic. We could just create a regular statement. So if the user is there, because right now auth is false anyways, and we can actually write this on one line, we can do $auth equals password verify. Password verify will return just a Boolean. So it'll return true or false. So hopefully you understand this logic. Auth is currently false. If we have a user, though, we need to check to make sure the password is correct. And we're going to take whatever Boolean password verify returns and apply it to auth. So if it's true, we'll be changing auth to true. If it's false, then no harm, no foul. It stays the way it is. If there's no user, auth will remain false. So we've covered all scenarios. So the first thing we need to add is the password itself, the raw password that the user provided. That's our first argument. The second argument is the user's hashed password, which is in the database, which we can access from user password. What if we execute and get errors? So if you actually apply and execute and this thing fails altogether, as a developer, you should be fixing your errors, because that would be not, it wouldn't likely be based on the user, it would be based on your code. Are you executing and getting errors? They're likely SQL errors. If you are concerned, no, the file says errors. Like, one thing you can do is wrap this in a try catch. Oh, check errors? Yeah, so that's because originally when I wrote this file, I know. Originally when I wrote the file a long time ago, I wasn't doing that thing in connection. So this is going back like 2 years. So this line here, I wasn't actually writing. And because I wasn't writing that line, any errors that were happening in the Connect PHP were stifled, and I actually had to reach out to the database and request those errors. So it would make an error, then I would reach out to the database and say, hey, do you have an error? The database would be like, yep, that last query was an error. And then I would go ahead and perform, some sort of thing based on that error. We're not going to have that in this scenario, because the only way you're going to get an error is, actually there's two ways. Your select statement, like your SQL statement, is incorrectly formatted, which as a developer you should fix, or your connection is a problem, which again as a developer you should fix. If it was an issue of wanting to log all of those errors, we'd actually have a logger, which PHP supports, which a student in the other class has enabled accidentally, and then they can't actually get their debugging information anymore. They're using WAMP in Windows, and it's problematic, and I can't figure out how to fix it for them. So if we don't have auth, so if $auth, meaning that it is failed, right? We're going to set our session messages for our notifier, as well as add the form values to the session variable. So let's start our session first, right? Start our session. Add our session errors, and we'll add the little square brackets at the end with an equal sign, which is essentially a push, right? This is the equivalence to array push. It will take whatever message here and shove it into this empty array that you see here, or add it to an existing array if there's already one there. So we're going to say your email password could not be verified. Nice and vague. Let's go ahead and add their form values as well. And this is just going to be equal to the post object. And then we're ready to redirect. And I mean, it makes sense to just redirect right back to the login form. So we would just do a location of login.php and then immediately exit, because we're going to have code under this as well. Exit or die, one of those two things. Now you might be like, well, we should write an else statement, but we don't need one because we are exiting out of the script at this point. We have concluded this if condition. It is actually more performant in your code to try to get away from writing many else statements. else statements are purposeful, right? Like if this, then that. But if this can resolve your whole issue and return your function call or whatever it is you're doing, then you might as well just complete it. And then if that doesn't validate, then you execute whatever else is here. The problem with an else statement is that if you have an else statement, this whole expression has to be validated by the interpreter. It has to be entirely read by the interpreter, both conditions, even though it's only going to execute one of them. So by avoiding using else statements, you actually create a more performant script. This will add our session successes. You have logged in successfully. And then header. And we're going to relocate them to our profile page. And we're going to exit. Alright, so let's recap quickly. So we're requiring our connection, just casting it into a new variable, right? Fetching our email address and our password from the input post, and we're lowercasing our email address as that's the way we were registering them originally. Users will type things in all caps. They don't understand that all capital letters for an email address versus all lowercase are two different things to a computer. They think the computer should know more than they do. Users honestly believe their computer is smarter than they are. They all think that. Then we write our SQL statement. We prepare our SQL statement. We bind our SQL statement. We execute our SQL statement. I mean, none of this stuff is new to you guys. You know all of this stuff. We've done it so many times, plus you did it so many times with Jess. We fetch our statement, right, our user, and then we have a little bit of newer logic here. We create, this is called a flag variable. The reason why it's called a flag variable is because you're using it to basically toggle state, right? So you're toggling between false and true. And then you use that later on to be able to make a decision, right? So they call it a flag variable. It's just a name. It doesn't change what it is, right? It is just a variable, but it is a name that we give them. So this flag variable here, we basically check our user to see if they're logged in, or to see if there is a user account, I mean. If there is, then we verify their password, which returns a Boolean, and we're storing it in here. If you're not fond of these single line if conditions, because I know some of you probably aren't, you can wrap it like this and write it as a non-single line if condition. However, it is common in PHP and loose-based languages to write things in shorthand. And it is a good idea to see these things and witness and experience these things, because more than likely when you first start out in your career, you're going to spend at least half a year to more to 2 years fixing other people's code. And so you're going to see stuff like this, and I don't want you to be like, what the heck is that? So then we're session starting, right? If auth is false, so that means either there was no user or the password verify failed, we don't care which, because we're not going to tell them specifically which, right? Then we just go ahead and create a nice generic error message, add their post request into the form values, and get the hell out of there. We relocate back to the login page. Hunky-dory, everybody's happy. Otherwise, we create another session success, and we relocate to the profile page. If I refresh this page right now, it's going to go to the profile page, because I'm pretty sure I entered all the information incorrectly. Yeah, I get you have logged in successfully, and I'm here, right? But I mean, at the end of the day, if I was to go here and try to log in and enter in something that isn't correct, your email password could not be verified. But I go to profile.php directly anyways. I can still access the same page even though my profile could not be validated. And that's because we need to set up gated access. Not to mention, we also have done we've missed one piece in our Authenticate.php that is super necessary for us to keep track of the user. But we'll do that at 8:20 after we take a small break. The next part of the lesson goes pretty quick. It's only about a half hour long, and then we'll be done. So actually, I'll leave it up to you. Do you want to take a 15-minute break or just power through for the next half hour and be done? I'm open to either. You're just down to continue? Alright, let's just continue on then, because I mean it makes sense. We'll just power through. Alright, so the next page we're going to open up then to work with is the profile.php page. So go ahead and open up your profile.php page. And right now it has a little piece in here that says if they're not logged in, redirect them. This is our gated validation, essentially. We're basically checking something to see if their user is logged in, and if they are not, we're going to redirect them and exit before they have any chance to view any of this content, right? Super important. So we're going to start a session, right? We'll start the session, and we're going to check to see if a certain session variable is actually created, because if it is, we're going to use that variable as the way to check to see if they're logged in. So I'm going to do if there is no session user, and actually we really just want to go is set. That's the better way to do that, so it's very concise. So if session user is not set, then we're going to, we can give them a message. It depends. Like, I'm kind of like 50-50 on this. You give a notification message saying, please log in first. But if they're accessing the profile page directly, they could have it bookmarked. Yeah, you see it does fall into both categories. It's one of those things. If it falls into both categories of potentially a hacker or an idiot, it's usually a good idea to give a notification message. If it falls into only the hacker realm, then you don't owe them any information whatsoever. But the second you involve the potential that it's an idiot, you need to make sure you add in some sort of notification to give the idiot some guidance. So let's do that. So we're going to do $_session errors. Please log in to access this content. Nice and straight and direct. We'll add a header as well. Location. And I mean, it makes sense to send them to the login page, as that's what we're talking about anyways. And then we'll exit directly afterwards. Exiting is super important here because we don't want any of this code to load. If we don't exit, it will load in the background. This page right now is blowing up because we actually use the user in here, user first name right here. Because we use the user in here, we need that information. We could go ahead and do, you know, a SQL request for the user itself. But I mean, we're going to store the user in the session variable. So all we really need to do is just do this. Whoops. There we go. We've assigned the user to the session user. This is a bit redundant. I mean, we could totally just use session user further down, but whatever. Just makes it clearer, I guess. It is terribly redundant. So if I refresh my page, it's going to go, please log in to access this content. If I try to access the profile.php page directly, though, I get the same thing. And that's because our gated validation is working for us. We are blocking this person from accessing, and we're providing them some information so that they know what they need to do. They need to log in to access this content. Some of you have been giving me Ajax in your phase 1 projects, and that's great until you introduce authentication. You need to find a way to deal with that so that those gated endpoints are also looking for this status to be done. It's not hard. It's pretty much exactly what we've been doing. Just keep that in mind, that you're going to have to make sure that you're checking in your scripts that the user is logged in before you just assume that you can give them data. Any questions about what we've done with the profile here? Or about the Authenticate? So the next piece we need to do then is go to authenticate.php and actually create this session user, because we don't have them. We log in right now, ASDF at asdf.com, ASDF, and I hit enter. It says I've logged in successfully, but really this is based on the fact that I have terrible CSS that's causing these two pieces to overlap each other. There's another one right behind it that says I'm not logged in, and then I need to log in. My experience is kind of shoddy here, right? I need to make sure that I have this variable being set so that when I log in, I'm hitting this page accurately. So the easiest way to do that is to go to the authenticate.php. Right here on line 38, just above this session successes, you have logged in successfully. We're going to create a new session variable here called user, and we're going to make it equal to $user. Can I give you the authenticate code? Yeah, I totally can. I'll do it as a paste bin though. Pasty bin. By the way, next week we'll be doing file uploads, and then that's it. We're done. The week after that is the final, which I've kind of come up with the decision just based on the fact that there's so many classes that I have this semester. There's no way I can do 120 practical exams. I just don't have time. There's no way I'll be able to mark all 120 by the deadline date. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a very, very well-coded test on Blackboard with some fill-in-the-blanks that are smart and use regular expression in order to match up your answers, and it will be a test done like that, probably with 20 questions or 30 questions. Some of them will be code submits, so I might give you a small logic problem and then you fill out the logic problem in your little submission answer, and then I just review it. So you should get back at least a good portion of what your mark will be right away, but I will have to review them. But it's much easier for me to review a small encapsulated problem than to review an entire project basically on the day. I know not everybody likes non-practical tests, and I know some people love non-practical tests. But yeah, it just makes it easier. It's better for you guys and it's better for me. Allows me to get all the marking done. All right. Did you get that, Nay? Awesome. Okay. So with that little piece added to here, when we log in now, profile.php should work. So if I go to ASDF at asdf.com and type in ASDF and log in, hello ASDF, welcome champion, your personalized experience awaits you. Look at that, we're logged in. We have gated access, right? So what's the last piece that we need? Obviously it's log out, right? We have gated access. The only thing we need left is to log out. So let's go to log out. So if I click log out right now, it doesn't work, right? And I come back to this page, you know, everything is the way it is. This I'm just going to scrap. Logging out is quite simple, but there are some considerations. One, should a person be able to access the logout page if they're not logged in? And I'm actually asking for an opinion. No. Okay. And why do you say no, Maggie?
If you're not logged in, then why would you have to access the logout page?
That's a valid answer. Does anybody have a different opinion? Why do you say yes, Andrew?
Because it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I am definitely on that side because it's an independent thing, right? So it doesn't matter whether you log out when you're logged in because you're not actually modifying anything in the database. You're not changing anything. There's no change. However, to side a little bit with Maggie, the user experience does get harmed, right? It's unlikely a user would bookmark a logout page, but it does happen. It's also unlikely that a person would go to the logout page directly, right? But if you provide a logout button, they will attempt to click it. So here's the kind of thing. We need to look at what we're doing with our actual user flow. If you look at the user flow and you access our login page directly, so let's go to login.php, right? You can't log out from this page. You can't log out from the register page either, right? You can only either go to login or go to register. Profile allows you to log out, but not to log in or register, right? Those fields have disappeared. So the one side to this is if you gate, because we'll call it that, if we gate logout and make it so that you can't access logout when you're logged in, then in theory we should also gate login and gate register, right? So you should not be able to log in if you're already logged in, and you should not be able to register a new user if you were already logged in, right? So everything should be gated in that scenario. Now, I know for your phase 2, you guys have to create authentication, and I honestly don't care. It's whatever opinion you choose to have about that particular thing. But if you do believe, for example, like Maggie, if you do believe that that should not be accessible content, then I would definitely take the profile where we take this gated access and apply it to your logout page. And it's not that hard. You know what? We'll do it because it's super simple. We'll just take this chunk here and we'll add it to our logout page, right? But this is one of those scenarios where if they're going to log out directly and they're clicking log out directly, kind of don't believe it's an idiot in this scenario. I kind of believe it's more likely somebody trying to find a vulnerability. So I'm not going to give them any information. All I'm going to do is shove them right back to the login page and call it a day. That's all I'm going to do. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to completely destroy their session. So I'm going to unset the session user, and that will remove our session that we're currently looking at, right? I'm going to create a session notification and just say you have been logged out successfully. And then I'm going to redirect them. And this is another thing that kind of leads to a bit of a debate. When you redirect the user, do you redirect them back to the login page, or do you redirect them back to a public page like the home page? So would you redirect back to the login page or to the home page if they've clicked log out? Yeah, and I kind of feel the same way, Thomas, that I would redirect them back to the home page, because if I'm a user and I logged out, why would I want to log back in again? That doesn't seem like the route path that I would take. I would take the home page path. So I agree. I would go back to index.php in that scenario. So we can test this by clicking log out. You have been logged out successfully. If you're not getting this message, Andrew, you're probably not getting this message. On your index page, there's a spot there, there's a comment that says notification.php. You just need to add an include there. And then you'll have that message. So I'll give you this. Logout.php. Control V. Seeing a login page after logging out would feel like a rickroll. Yeah. That is another option. You could just relocate them to YouTube and just rickroll them. That would be totally funny. You have no idea how many students have rickrolled me, by the way, with projects. It has happened to me so many times. I can't even count how many times it's happened. Everybody thinks it's funny. All right, I'm going to log in. ASDF at asdf.com, ASDF, and I'm going to click login, and I've logged in successfully. Right? That's fine, but like I said, I can still access login.php. So if I want to shut that off so that I have no access to that as well, let's just take our code again, our little chunk of code, go to login.php, right? And we want this to happen before anything else happens. We need to get rid of that session start, though, that's down there. We want to get rid of this session start, right? And what we're doing now is we're not going to check if it's not set. We're going to check if it is set. And if it's set, we're not going to log in. We're going to profile, right? So we're modifying that a bit. So if they come to this page and they're logged in and they hit refresh, nope, you're automatically sent to the profile page. So you can't access the login page while you're actually logged in, right? Same with the register.php. It's the same chunk of code for register.php, right? Here, I'll give you this block. This block goes at the top of the login.php page. So with register.php, same thing. I'm just going to copy this chunk, go to register.php, and right after the session start, I'm just going to plug it in, get rid of so we don't have two of them because you can only have one, right? Hit refresh, and I'm right back to profile. And now I can't access those public pages anymore. Log in. Nope. Send back to profile. Whoa. Hey, that's cool. I didn't know that was there. And register. Not a chance. Get redirected for both. But if I log out, now I can access register and I can access login, right? Good user experience, but that's really all it is because these are idempotent actions anyways. It's just a good user experience. Well, technically register is not an idempotent action because if you are logged in, you could continually register new users, right? And maybe they don't want you to be able to do that, but arguably you could log out and register new users. So what's the difference? Any questions about any of that stuff? So I will push this code up. Right now it's not actually pushed up with those pieces. I think I'll actually create you guys your own version of GitHub because it is slightly different than the one that I did with the other class. This is the only piece I need from that. I'll give you a hand here in a second too, sure. Let me just push this code up for people and then I'll go ahead and give you a hand. We'll git bash here. All right. And then I need to git set my remote. I can never remember how to do this. Git change remote. Slack gives me one more accept cookies thing. I'm going to lose my mind. I've already accepted it a few times now. There we go. Set that upstream. There we are. And then then I will add that to your Blackboard. Under this thing, instead of this completed examples that is here, I'll just remove that. Because it's the one that's from last week anyways. And I'll add this as a new web link for you. And there you go. Okay, so too sure you're facing an internal server error. So internal server errors are caused by code. Always. Never fail. Always caused by a code issue. Can you share your screen? Do you have any other debugging information beside that? Yes, you're free to go. Yeah, you're totally free to go. That is it for the night. Nice short lesson to